So, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about what's new in Onshape. And if you haven't attended one of these webinars in the past, this webinar is really focused on what was added in the last 30 days, right? The last month of Onshape, what was added. And we're going to go into detail on some of those features and some of the bigger improvements that were added with these updates and allow you to ask any questions that you'd like. So this is really your opportunity to ask any questions. There's a questions dialog there in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question that you'd like, and I'll do my best to stop and answer the questions as we go through things here today. So again, the goal is to go through all of the improvements that have happened over the last month or so. So let's jump into things. Now, before I get started with the topics of the day, there are always a few things that I like to mention about Onshape in general. And one of the first is our mission statement, our goal with Onshape, and that is getting everyone working together with CAD on any device, anywhere. This includes any computer, Windows, Mac, Linux, Chromebook. It also includes any mobile device. You can have iOS devices, iPads, iPhones, Android phones or tablets, and you have full CAD features from any of these devices. And so you can create sketches, features, parts, assemblies from your phone, from your tablet, from any computer with a modern browser. And so it's really about, getting everyone working together with CAD on any device, anywhere they happen to be. That's our mission with Onshape. Now, the other element of this is, of course, Onshape itself is professional 3D CAD. When you think of professional 3D CAD, you think of parts, assemblies, and drawings. But Onshape has a lot of things that you don't get in other professional 3D CAD systems. First, the frequent updates. A lot of what we're talking about here in this webinar is our frequent updates and the improvements that come with those updates. If you're not familiar with our update process, roughly every 3 weeks, new features are being added. I'm going to go into that in greater detail in a second, but we update very, very often. We do not have a once a year update. We update roughly every 3 weeks, and it means they're evolving at a very quick rate. Now, also with Onshape comes the ability to version control built in. Now, if you've come from other CAD systems, this is something that was generally an add-on, something you had to purchase and manage separately. PDM level kind of functionality. That's core Onshape functionality. The ability to capture versions, the ability to see the history, all of that is core Onshape functionality. Now, also with Onshape comes the ability to import and export common CAD formats. So, if you have a library of CAD data, or if you're working with another CAD system, you can import and work with that CAD data in Onshape. And you can export to a lot of formats as well. So if you want to send it off, send your CAD data off in a certain format to someone, you can export to a number of different formats. Obviously, step IGES Parasolid, the obvious ones are there. You can import any of those formats, but you can also import native formats, SolidWorks parts, SolidWorks Pack and Go assemblies, Inventor parts. There's a long list of different supported formats. You'll find that, by the way, under the help if you're interested in a specific format. So read and write common CAD formats. It means that Onshape works really well with your existing CAD data. It works really well alongside existing CAD applications. The next thing I want to mention is entirely new methods of collaboration. This is something that's very unique to Onshape. No other CAD system will give you this, and that's the ability to collaborate in real time on the same model. And so if you share your document with someone and you make a change, they instantly see that change real time. So real time, simultaneous collaboration between users. The biggest thing I like to stress is you just never have to worry about check in, check out. Is this the latest version? Do I have the right files? If you're working on the same data set, there's a whole bunch of administrative issues that just disappear. So new methods of collaboration really tried to improve the collaborative experience at the core Onshape level, but also little things like comments. You can integrate comments into your document. You can tag users or features with comments. Also, the ability to see each other's screen in real time with follow mode. These are all things that we've done to try and improve that collaborative experience. Because right now, if users want to share CAD design, most of them today are emailing CAD files around. This is something that's very unique to Onshape. Again, no other CAD system can do this, and that's because of our unique architecture. Now, the last thing I want to mention is customization with feature script. This is something that is, again, very unique to Onshape. It's a language that we developed that allows you to build your own CAD feature. So if you're at all interested in writing code, you're at all interested in CAD and potentially saving yourself some time with a custom written feature, definitely check out FeatureScript. It's worth checking out. It's the core of Onshape's Part Studio, and it's a very important part of how Onshape functions. Really, though, intended for those that are looking for a way to automate features and to speed up the design process and are interested in writing a custom feature for them. So that's customization with FeatureScript. These are always just some things I like to mention about Onshape in general before we get into the topic of the day. Now, the topic of the day is the updates, and in particular, 2 updates that have taken place in the last 30 days or so, essentially since the last time we did this webinar. So for those not familiar with the process, Onshape updates roughly every 3 weeks. So roughly every 3 weeks, you're going to get an update to Onshape. And the neat thing about them is they're totally automatic and transparent, meaning they happen in the background. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to install or download or update. There's no process for you at all. You simply log in and new features are there. The other benefit of this is we never have a version discrepancy. So in more traditional file-based system like a SolidWorks, for instance, you have the issue of, is this the right version of the file? Right? I saved this in 2017. You're using 2016. Now you can't open my file. Right? So there's always this version discrepancy. It causes all kinds of compatibility issues. Those go away with Onshape. Everybody using Onshape is using the same version of it. So you never have the version discrepancy that comes from installed CAD software. Now, of course, these updates that happen roughly every 3 weeks include new functionality, and that's what we're here talking about today. So new features are constantly being added. Roughly every 3 weeks, you're going to see new icons, new settings, new options in your commands. And what we're talking about here today are those new improvements. Now, before we get into the last month, just the last 30 days, I just want to highlight a few things that have come this year. So if you've been watching us, you'll know we've been hard at work this year adding a lot of very important features for those pro users out there. Things like simultaneous sheet metal, managed in-context design, curve tools, surfacing tools, custom properties, folders. All of these things are really important features to a lot of users out there. So if you haven't seen Onshape in a while, if you haven't used Onshape in the past, year or so, just realize we now have sheet metal. We have in-context assembly design. We have surfacing tools like fill and complex curve tools. So we've added a whole bunch of new things. We're going to focus on just the last month. But if you go back and look, you'll see every 3 weeks or so, we're constantly pushing new updates. And by the way, if you're interested, we do have a blog post that you can sign up for and get email notifications of these updates. So if you do a search on Onshape What's New, at the bottom of one of our What's New blogs, you can subscribe to it. So these are just a few of the highlights. Literally hundreds of updates have taken place in the last 10 months. I wanted to pick just a few that I think are most important to a lot of users out there. So if you haven't checked out Onshape in a while, definitely check us out again. Sheet metal, in-context design, these were big things for a lot of users out there, and we've just added them as of this year. Now, let's focus on the last 30 days or so, right? The last month or so. And we're going to take a look at 2 recent updates, September 26th and October 19th. So we're going to focus on just those 2 updates that took place in the last month or so. And what I'd like to do is just pick a few improvements from each one and walk you through them. If you have any questions about them, again, feel free to ask it. There's a little questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question that you'd like, and I'll walk through the questions as we go through things here today. So that's the agenda. Now, as I mentioned before, 2 updates to discuss, and I'm going to kind of cherry pick some of my favorite improvements from them and walk you through it. So let's start with September 26th. September 26th, I think the biggest improvement in this update was definitely draft analysis. Draft analysis is something that a lot of users have requested. If you do any kind of work with drafted faces, things like injection molded parts or cast parts where draft is especially important for parts to be released from a mold, for example, then draft analysis is a critical feature for you. And it's something that a lot of users requested, and it was added as of this September 26th update. So again, I think overwhelmingly the big improvement in this update is draft analysis. So if you haven't used draft analysis yet, if you do this kind of work, it's definitely a certain type of CAD work for sure. But if you do this type of work, it's a really critical function. It's something that again, was important to a lot of users. So draft analysis was a big one. Another big improvement came to the loft command. And in the past, the loft command was somewhat limited in what you could select for things like your profiles or your guides. You were limited to one selection. And if you had a combination of entities, you had to do things like convert them to curves and so on to use them in a loft command. So what we've done is improve the loft command that allows you to select just about anything and turn it into a combination of entities. I'm going to explain why this is important in just a bit, but in short, it just means the loft command is in general a lot easier to use. There's a lot less setup that you have to do and a lot less things you have to think about when you create a loft. Another big improvement with this update is the ability to see the regeneration times of your features. This was another highly requested one. How can I see how long each feature is taking to rebuild, and therefore troubleshoot performance and so on? You can now see your regeneration times of your features in your Part Studio. And I'm going to show you how you can do that in just a second. Real simple, but a valuable tool, especially if you're troubleshooting a slow Part Studio. It can tell you, what features are taking the most time. Now, the other one that's especially valuable is restoring assembly instances. This is a simple one. It sounds like a simple one, and it is, but it makes a huge difference if you do a lot of assembly building and you find yourself inserting all these parts and you accidentally click the X to cancel. I've done this myself. I know a lot of users have told me they've done this, and all those parts that you inserted just disappear. Now you'll have an option to restore them. And I'll explain this in greater detail in a bit, but it's just kind of a fail-safe. If you accidentally click X after spending all this time positioning and inserting all these parts, you can restore it. Another one that was very, very highly requested was dual dimensions. So in the drawings, you now can display dual dimensions, and you could do this on a per dimension level, or you could do it on a drawing level with drawing properties. Now, there are many other drawing improvements to mention. I may mention just a few of them, but for time's sake, we're going to go by many of them. Just realize that with both this update and the October update, we added a lot of drawing improvements. Little subtle things like hiding and showing the bin lines, or the ability to snap to different quadrants on an arc, all little things that can make a big difference if you're spending a lot of time in drawings. So many drawing improvements. Unfortunately, we won't have the time to get to all of them here today, but I will try and point out some of the bigger ones. So let's start this. Now, draft analysis is the first one that I want to start with, of course, and it's definitely, in my opinion at least, the biggest improvement in this update. Now, I realize there are those users out there that will never use draft analysis. It's kind of a tool for a certain type of work, but for that type of work, it's really a critical tool. If you're not familiar with it, the idea behind it is it looks at all the faces in your part and tells you if they have the appropriate amount of draft based on a number that you specify, draft angle that you specify. And this is really important when we talk about mold making and the ability to create moldable designs that can easily eject from the mold. Draft is a very important value for that. And you want to have generally a draft of a certain angle or more depending on a number of different factors. And so the ability to check all the faces and say, do these faces have enough draft, is an important step in the process if you're doing that. And that's where draft analysis comes in. Now, to use draft analysis, very simple. You'll find it under the ViewCube dropdown at the very bottom here, just above section view. All right, so just above section view, you have draft analysis. Now, I've already turned this on, but the first time you use this, you'll see a dialog here that pops up. And it's up to you to specify a few things. First off, what is your mold split direction? Right? This is where your cavity and core split. In this example, it's just going to be this face of my power drill. Then, what's your minimum draft angle? Right? What is that minimum value that you consider acceptable for your draft? And then just select a part to check. Now, a few things. First off, you have side 1, side 2. So you're going to see a darker blue and a lighter blue to represent side 1, side 2. The colors that you should be concerned with are two. First off, the yellow, which indicates steep, and then you have red, which indicates an undercut. Right? Undercuts are, of course, going to give you an issue when you go to create your mold. So those are the two colors to really concern yourself with. Now, one thing I would stress is as you mouse over these faces, you're going to see the draft angle of those faces appear. Right, so I can see all of these are 1 degree as I mouse over those faces. So that's an important tip. If you're curious, this is showing up as yellow and I'm not sure why, move your mouse over that face and you're going to see the angle appear there next to your cursor. Right? Question: will you be doing cavity core creation? I'm not certain if we have plans, at least in the immediate terms, for more specific mold tools like that. I will say there are a lot of users out there creating molds in Onshape today with our Boolean commands. Yeah, so it is absolutely possible today to create molds just using Boolean operations. I don't know if we're going to add more specific mold making functions in the near term. I will say use the feedback tool and we can add you. I'm sure we have other users out there in that industry looking for mold specific tools. And we can let you know, and maybe we can add that in the near term. I'm not aware of any plans as of today to do that, but again, we constantly reprioritize. So, again, just telling you the draft angle is a simple enough thing. It just says, this is 1 degree. You have a filter of 2 degrees minimum, and I can adjust that. So if I decide that 3 degrees should be the minimum, then I realize, I have a whole bunch of faces that I need to address, right? So you really simple, set a filter, a number that you consider acceptable. Anything less than that is going to show up as yellow. Anything undercut will show up as red, right? And anything acceptable is going to show either as baby blue or dark blue, depending on the side. Now, this stays around. So if I accept the draft analysis, it stays up, and I can go in and edit features if I want to from here, right? So just realize you can go in and make changes, edit features, accept the features, all with draft analysis on, which of course can be really valuable. As I go through and start to troubleshoot each one of these little yellow faces that I thought had the appropriate amount of draft but doesn't, I can easily edit those and do that with draft analysis on and see them update. So that's really the idea behind draft analysis. It's kind of a mode that you turn on and off, very similar to hidden edges visible or the different display styles that you have. Now, another thing I wanted to mention about draft analysis is you can select multiple parts in a single draft analysis. So if I go to edit my draft analysis, you'll see in the bottom right here, edit draft analysis. I can choose more than one entity to check. And what's really unique about this is Onshape is always checking in both directions. So you don't have to do anything special. There's no multiple directions you have to specify. You just choose multiple parts, and from your mold split direction, it's automatically going to go both ways. So you'll see, and I can even, by the way, hide the other part here. Here we have the same thing on this side, right? So there's no need to reverse directions or do multiple different draft analysis. You can do everything in that one draft analysis, just specify multiple parts, and it will automatically look in both directions from your mold split direction that you specify, when you're creating it, right? So from this face, it's going to look in both directions relative to the entities you check. Right? So very easy to use. Again, the colors that you're looking for are the yellows and the reds. Those are your needs attention, so to speak, faces, and you can leave this up and active as you go through and edit features. So that is the draft analysis command. Again, you'll find it under the ViewCube dropdown. If you turn it on, it stays on until you turn it off. So I can go to shaded, for instance, and now I'm out of draft analysis. So again, think of it as a view mode, no different than translucent or hidden edges visible. It's just a different way of displaying your model. Another thing I mentioned, I showed this just briefly earlier, but if you create that initial draft analysis, you don't have to reset the mold split direction and all that every single time. It will remember those things if you go back to it. So as you can see here, I just go back to draft analysis. It automatically populates, with the same exact, details that it had just a moment ago. So that is draft analysis. Let's move on to the next one in my list. Now, draft analysis was definitely the big improvement, I think, for a lot of users out there. It's one that was just, a must-have type of tool. But the next one is especially important to, I think, a larger audience. And I think if you do the loft command, if you've ever used the loft command, you're probably a candidate for these new improvements, at least, checking out some of these new improvements. In the past, if you wanted to use a loft, you had to select very specific things. If you wanted to create a loft, you had to select a sketch region with no nested contours. And if you want to select a guide for your loft, you had to select one selectable entity as the entirety of your guide. So if your guide consisted of 3 or 4 different things, you had to do things like create a composite curve and kind of, create one selectable entity. So there's all these kind of very strict rules, I'll say, to the loft command. And it meant that, it could make it difficult to use at times, for relatively simple things. So I want to give you an example of this kind of scenario. So this is a loft example. I'm going to loft from this to this to this, and if I select loft command and I just start selecting contours, the problem that I have is, as you can see, I have a nested contour region within my first selection, right? So in the past, you simply couldn't use this sketch as your loft profile. It didn't work. Now what you can do is you can expand each one of your profile selections and add to it. And this becomes valuable in a scenario like this because now I can add this sketch region, the inside of that sketch region, as both entities that make up one profile. So the improvement here is you can select a combination of things. In this case, a combination of 2 faces, but they could be a combination of multiple edges or, edge, sketch, curve, line. You can select a combination of different things and make them one entity for your profile, one entity for your loft guide. And it means that you don't have to do as much kind of working around the strict rules of loft. Now I can use this sketch, select both faces, and now I can use that as a profile for my loft, and it will work, as you can see here. So this was something that if you'd have to edit the sketch, make this construction geometry, create a new sketch, and so it took working around essentially. Now you can select multiple entities and make them one profile, or you can select multiple entities and you make them one guide. And let me give you an example of this. So in our loft, we want to follow these. Let me cancel out real quick. These lines. So line, arc, line. That's what I want the loft to follow. The problem that I have is this is 3 separate entities. And if you tried to do this in the past, you'll know it didn't work, right? If I tried to add this as the guide in my loft, it's assumed that one selection was one guide in entirety, not the combination of 3 makes up one guide. So now let's go back to loft. We'll select our profiles. Now if I go to guides, same thing. I can select a line, expand. You'll notice it doesn't work by default. I just selected this one entity and said that's the guide for my entire loft, which of course it's not. But if I expand on the selection, click inside of the edges, curves, and so on, I can left-click each of the pieces that make up that one guide, right? So now you can see this is one guide comprised of 3 entities. Now in the past, you had to create a composite curve in this scenario. You no longer have to do that, right? So same thing on this side. I could say line and expand the selection, click in the box, select the second line, and now I have a single guide comprised of two different sketch entities. Now, these could be edges of a model, they could be sketch entities, they could be other curves. That's another very common example, of course, for guides. But just realize you can select multiple entities and make up one guide, or select multiple entities and make up one profile. Both are now acceptable in the loft command. So again, subtle improvements, but definitely big user-centric improvements, right? You don't have to do nearly as much setup work for a loft. There's nowhere near as strict rules associated with the loft command, and it means it's just more flexible. It allows you to select more things and use more things without setting them up ahead of time. Right. So that those are the improvements to the loft command. Again, really just the ability to select all of those entities and say this is one selectable reference for my loft, whether it be a profile or guide. That's what's been added in this September 26th update. Now, the next one is also very simple to show. It's show regeneration times, and it's something that a lot of users requested. I have this part studio that's slow, and I don't know why, and I want to be able to see what's taking the most time when we talk about a feature regeneration. Question. Can I use a spiral as a loft guide? It depends on the complexity of the spiral. I don't know. I don't know that there's a limitation. I don't think that there'd be any specific limitation. I think what you'll run into potentially is twist causing an issue that might cause the loft to fail, but I don't think there's any specific limitations with regards to spirals and lofts. I would just be very conscious of the twist in the loft based on the spiral, and does that cause it to otherwise fail? But no, you shouldn't have any issues selecting the spiral as a loft guide. Okay, so showing regeneration times is really straightforward. Essentially, in every Part Studio now, you're going to see a little stopwatch icon in the very top right corner of your feature list, and if you left-click that, it's going to bring out the regeneration times dialog. All right, so there's a little dialog that flies out and lists all of your feature regeneration times. And you can mouse over them and see, okay, this circular pattern is taking almost 6 seconds to rebuild. This circular pattern is taking almost a full second to rebuild, right? And I can go through and figure out what is causing the issues. Now, just from past experience and time, oftentimes it could be complex patterns, spirals, and cutting threads is a common example of a feature that can take a lot of resources. But this will at least help you to find the feature that is causing the issue. I can see here this circular pattern is taking 6 seconds to rebuild, which is way more than any other. And the complexity of that feature may have a performance issue. And maybe it's aesthetic. Maybe I don't need that feature on all the time, and I can easily right-click and suppress it. A few things I like to point out. Initially, it sorts by the regeneration time. So you're going to get at the top, of course, what is the slowest to regenerate. And I think that's what most users want. But you can filter. You can say, show me the fastest. I can go up and down and do it that way. I can also filter by the feature name. So if I've gone through the effort of naming my features, or if I just want to see them in alphabetical order, I can. But I think most important for a lot of users out there is relative to the feature number, right? So I can see it in the same order that I see the feature list. And then, of course, I can scroll through and see which of the features takes the most time. I think the most useful is just to define the feature that's taking the most time, mouse over it, it highlights in the graphics what that is, and you can immediately identify, okay, this is the thing that's causing me 6 seconds every time I rebuild it, right? So that is show regeneration times. Again, it's the little stopwatch icon on the top right corner of your feature list. So you're going to see it here, and it's going to fly out with a separate dialog. To close it, you can hit the X in the top right corner. All right, so that is show regeneration times. Let's move on to the next one. Restoring assembly instances in the assembly, of course. Now, this is particularly important when you're inserting parts into your assembly, right? So as I go in and start to choose parts that I want to insert, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll left click and we'll just start inserting a whole bunch of parts at once. Right? So if you're not familiar with the insert process, you can insert multiple parts in a single shot rather quickly, just left clicking each one. The problem is the mistake that's often made is I'm done inserting parts. I come up here and I intend to hit the green check. I accidentally hit the red X and I escape out. What's new is this option right here to restore. So at the very top, if you hit the X after the insert, you're going to get a little message that says, would you like to restore? And you can restore those, and that's just going to insert those parts back into your assembly. This sounds like a trivial thing, but it could be a really big thing if you spend a lot of time, inserting parts. And there are a lot of users out there that have even gone through the level of, I insert and mate the parts in a single shot using snap mode and mate connectors. And, in that case, the insert dialog is up the entire time I'm inserting parts. And I certainly don't want accidentally hitting the red X to cause me to lose all of that work. Right? So that's the idea behind the restore. If you hit cancel on accident, it will allow you to insert those parts, restore those parts back into your assembly. Just solves the frustration, which again, for a couple parts isn't such a big deal, but when we start talking about dozens and all the mates that can come with snap mode being on when it's inserted, it can be a frustrating thing to have that happen. So that is restoring assembly instances. It just restores those parts if you accidentally click the X. Moving on, and by the way, you do have to click that. I do want to stress, of course, you have to click the restore option there at the top to actually get those back. Now, the next one is very, very important when we talk about drawings, and that is dual dimensions in drawings. Dual dimensions is a very critical thing for a lot of companies, a lot of different designs, and it was a limitation in the past. Now, if you mouse over a dimension, you'll see the flyout, right? The dimension dialog flyout. You mouse over that flyout, and you'll see an option for dual dimension. So this is how you change an individual dimension to dual dimension, right? So if I click dual dimension, now you can see I have both units on that one dimension, right? So again, left click, mouse over the dialog, select dual dimensions in the dropdown. In the dialog. So that's on a per dimension basis, right? Left click each individual dimension. If you want to change every single dimension to dual dimensions, you have to do that from the properties. So in the top left corner, left click properties, you'll see the option here for dual dimensions. That will make every dimension in your drawing dual dimensions, and you have the option for showing the second units there as well. And you can set other things here as well. I'm not going to get into too great a detail, but just realize if you want to make that a kind of global change on all of the dimensions in a drawing, you'll want to do it from the properties, not not individually, obviously. Sometimes I exit out of sketches accidentally. Will restore work on sketches? Yes. In fact, the assembly behavior that I just showed you, that restore assembly was mimicked after the behavior you get in a sketch. So for a long time now, you've had an option at the top to restore after canceling a sketch. So absolutely. That restore ability, we kind of took that from sketching and made it the same in assemblies. So, all right. So the next thing on my list, again, this is dual dimensions. You could do it at the property at the drawing level, or you can do it one at a time by selecting dimensions. The next one on my list, there were a number of different drawing improvements that are worth mentioning in both of these updates. So I'm not going to get into too greater detail on most of them. The big ones in this update were improvements to ordinate dimensions. So you can grab and drag an entire group of ordinate dimensions, and a new 2-point circle center line that was added as of this update. But for time's sake, we have to move on. So I'm going to move on to the October 10th. Oh, excuse me, October 19th. Let me change that. So October 19th, 2017, we added an update. And I think for almost everyone out there would agree, the big improvement for this update was the ability to create folders and the ability to organize your documents within folders. I think for a lot of users out there, creating a lot of documents, organizing all of those documents can become troublesome, can become difficult, right? When you start to have many documents, how do you structure them? So what we've added in this update is the ability to create folders, and this is folders at the documents page level. So you can organize your documents within folders, and this has all kinds of implications. We start talking about sharing, permissions, and so on. So I want to spend a little bit of time getting into creating folders, creating subfolders, how to add documents to folders, how to share a folder, and so on. But I definitely think folders were the big improvement with this update. I always have to point out, I think, the biggest improvement, and I think this is it. Folders is definitely the big improvement with this update. Now, I think, second, at least in my opinion, is a small but very, very usable keyboard shortcut for Select Other. If you're at all familiar with Select Other, if you're at all a user of Select Other to select things, we've made it a lot simpler with this update. In fact, you can use it without ever touching the mouse, which is really neat. But it makes it just really easy to select hidden edges and do less rotating of the model to grab the things that you need. You can use Select Other, and it's just a lot more user friendly. Especially if you're a fan of keyboard shortcuts. If you're a keyboard shortcut type of person, you're going to love these improvements. I'll explain why in greater detail. But it's more than just a simple keyboard shortcut. There's little things that make it pretty neat. The next thing on my list is going to be very big if you do sheet metal, and that is pattern and mirror. You can now pattern and mirror sheet metal parts, and that's a really big thing. If you're designing symmetric sheet metal, anything, you oftentimes want to design the half and then mirror to create the whole. And in the past, you couldn't do that and still get a flat view, right? A flat pattern. So you can now mirror or pattern sheet metal parts and add them back to the original, merge them with everything and get one flat view. And that was a limitation in the past. Another one that was added with this update is going to be particularly important for those doing surface modeling is you now have an option for guides in the fill surface command. And what's really unique about this is you can specify, I want to follow the guides precisely, or I want a sample. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this in just a bit. But it becomes really critical when you have guides that may not necessarily terminate exactly at the edges of your surface or of your fill. And so, in those scenarios where your curve may not be perfect, but is good enough for the shape that you want, sampling is a good option. So fill surface, the ability to use guides in general. In the past, with a fill, you could not use guides. So it was just a limitation. You could define the edge conditions of all the different edges that you specify, but you couldn't use guides in combination with that. Now, as always, as the previous improvements, as the past improvements for quite a long time now, there's a lot in drawings that was added with this update. Unfortunately, we just don't have tons of time to get into, but I will try and point out a few of the important ones. In my opinion, the big ones for drawings in this update is the ability to copy or duplicate a drawing. Right? Duplicate's a better word for it. So you can take an existing drawing, right-click, and duplicate it. Great if you want to make small variations of drawings. And you can also duplicate assemblies, by the way, as well. I do want to mention that. But another important drawing improvement is copying annotations. So you can Alt-drag and copy a note, or Alt-drag and copy a balloon or a tolerance symbol, right? So Alt-drag copying annotations on your drawings is just a really easy workflow for adding in multiple annotations, multiple balloons, those kinds of things. So those are, I think, at least in my opinion, the big drawing improvements. Another one that I want to mention, I will show this just briefly too, is you can now hide the bin lines in a sheet metal flat. So if you don't care to see the bin lines when you create a drawing of your sheet metal flat pattern, you can hide them. It's a right-click menu now. Right-click menu option, I should say. All right, so let's jump into these now. The big one that I want to spend the most time on, of course, is folders. And so I'm going to spend a bit more time on folders than some of the other improvements, because I think it's probably the biggest improvement in this update. So I want to try and answer as many of the questions that I think are going to come up, as I can. So first off, how do you create a folder? You'll find the option under the Create dropdown. Right, so you click Create Folder. Let's call this. I'm just going to call this Folder Hardware. So I click Create Folder. I click Create, and now I have a folder here at the top. All right. Now you'll find these folders under My Onshape. So it's important to keep in mind, as I start to go through all these different filters, I don't necessarily see the folders. You see that under My Onshape. Now, I can, create a single level folder like this. I can drill down into the folder by left clicking it. So now I'm inside of the folder, and you can see those breadcrumbs here at the top. So it's telling me My Onshape is kind of the top level. And then within My Onshape, I have a folder called Hardware. Now, if I go to create another folder while in this folder, right? Remember, I'm currently in the folder called Hardware. It's going to create a subfolder, right? So I can say, inside of Hardware, we're going to create a folder called Cylinders, right? So now if I go into Cylinders, you can see My Onshape, Hardware, Cylinders. And if I want to go back a level, I can left click here. If I want to go back to My Onshape, I can left click there. Now, the next question that comes up often is, how do I put documents into these folders? And of course, there's two ways. You're either going to create a new document and put it into a folder, or you're going to move an existing document into a folder. So let's talk about both. First, how do I create a new document and ensure that it's in a folder? Go into the folder, then create document. Right? So while in the folder, if I create a document, we'll call this cylinder, okay. Now I'm creating a document inside of that folder, right? So if I jump back here, now I've got the cylinder inside of the cylinders folder. If I jump back out, you can see no documents within Hardware, just folder with documents within that. So that's the first way. Again, if you're in a folder, as I am now, you can see from the top here that I'm in a folder, and you create a document, that document will be inside of that folder. Now, the next question then is, well, what about moving documents to folders, right? I either created it in the wrong place, or I created it before folders, and now I need to start to move things around. You can right-click and choose the option to move to, right? Then choose the folder that you want. All you need to do is click Move here, and it will move that. Now, keep in mind, you will not be able to move documents that have been shared with you into a folder, and that's because of the potential for a permissions conflict. So just realize, this is really intended for documents that created by you, not necessarily shared with you. So you can move your documents into folders by right-clicking them and then browsing to the folder that you want to move them into, and then choosing the option to move here. Question, can I share folders with others? Yes. So one of the biggest benefits of creating a folder is it creates a fast way to share a lot of documents at once. So if I select the folder and I hit share, I'm sharing everything inside of that folder. And that's an important caveat to mention. When you share a folder, you're sharing the entire folder, right? So you really don't want to put stuff in there that you don't want anyone that you're sharing with to see. So that's kind of a given, but I want to stress it. Everything in the folder is going to be shared when you share it. Now, that's also a very big benefit, and the reason I point that out is the scenario of like teams or companies where, I have a folder with, that's just kind of our library of parts, and within that library of parts, we have folders for custom brackets. We have folders for custom cylinders. We have all these standard pieces of hardware that we use. We've put this folder structure together, and all you need to do is share that one folder with the company, and everyone has access to this standard library parts. So it's very much a big plus when we're talking about teams and companies working on Onshape, because it means that you can work out of that single set of data. It works no differently than sharing a document, in the sense that you're really just defining individuals you want to share with, teams you want to share with, or companies. Now, the question that will come up with this is, I have a folder. I've shared a folder, structural team, edit permissions, right? Now, what about the individual permissions of a document within the folder? The permissions of the folder supersede the permissions of the document. So if I come in now and say structural team can view, that won't make a difference, because at the higher level, sorry, I jumped out of that, at the folder level, they have edit permissions, and that will supersede the individual document level that they're in, right? Now, another question I didn't answer is a very good question. If I share a folder, will subfolders be shared with it? Yes, absolutely. So if you share a folder with subfolders, you're sharing everything in that folder, including subfolders and all the documents in each subfolder. So again, keep in mind, when you share, you're sharing everything in the document, everything in the folder, I should say, including all documents. And the permissions of the folder supersede the permissions of the document. So if these permissions are looser at the folder level than the individual document level, those are the ones that are taken. I hope I'm making that clear. Okay, so that is a quick intro into folders. Again, just stressing, if you share a folder, it's a very valuable way of sharing like a company's hardware, or a certain series of docs that you want a team to work with. It's a very good organizational tool as well, just for yourself, as a way to structure your data. Another question that often gets asked: you can send folders to the trash, and that will send all of the documents within the folders to the trash, right? So if you want to delete folders, make sure to move everything out of them first, then send the folders to the trash, right? So just keep in mind, when you right-click a folder and you say send to trash, you're sending all the subfolders, all the documents within the subfolders, you're sending all of that to the trash. All right, so that is a quick intro into folders. I did want to mention those. I think that's something that a lot of users requested for a long time. And mainly it's just about, the sharing mechanisms, the ability to share a folder and specify, individual permissions for teams and things like that based on a group of documents at once rather than one document at a time, right? All right. So that is folders. Let's move on. The select other keyboard shortcut. So it sounds like a very small thing, and it is. It's not a giant improvement, but it is something that can make a big difference if you're a fan of the select other command. In the past, you had to do this by right-clicking. So if you moused over a face and you wanted to select the edge behind it, you had to right-click, select other, browse through the list, and find the edge in the list and the select other. But it took the right-click, select other to bring up the menu. Now you can do this with a keyboard shortcut. Now, the keyboard shortcut varies depending on where you're at. If you're in the US, it's the Grave symbol, the Grav symbol at the top, the Grav accent, I should say, at the top left. But it varies. So just keep in mind, it's going to be dependent on your location. I would definitely check the what's new. I think we posted the German, Spanish, and a few other keyboard shortcuts for this as well. But it's really simple to use. You mouse over a face, you select the keyboard shortcut. Now, in my case, again, it's the Grave accent, the tilde symbol at the top left corner. So if I mouse over a face and I hit that icon, or I hit that key on the keyboard, there is select other. So do it again. Right. The neat thing about this is, as you move your mouse, it will update, right? So if I move my mouse cursor down here and I do select other, I can see it's a list of those edges or faces. But if I move my mouse over here, same thing, the list updates, of course. So I can continue to move my mouse, hit the key, and it will update through that, right? Now, another question then is, well, if I mouse over this, I hit the grave accent, right, at the top left. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. But it's the key just below the escape key, the tilde symbol. If I select that and then I hit it again, it goes through the selections. It goes through the list. This means that I can go through the list of select other without touching the mouse, and I think that's the key thing. So if I mouse over an edge, say I mouse over this edge, I hit the keyboard shortcut, select other appears, I hit the keyboard shortcut again, it drops down in the list. And you can see I'm going through all of these, right? All I need to do is hit enter, and I've selected that, select other selection. So again, you can go through the list just by continuing to hit that keyboard shortcut, and you can even hit shift and then the same key on the keyboard, and it will go up the list. But again, the big thing I'd like to stress is just that you don't have to use the right click, select other to bring up this dialog, and you can use nothing but keyboard shortcuts to not only bring up the command, but go through the list of each one in the command. Just very fast way to grab an edge without a lot of mouse movement, without a lot of clicks. I think that's the big thing. Especially valuable if you're a fan of keyboard shortcuts. So again, the select other key, the big thing I would say is if you continue to hit that key, it will iterate, it will go through the select other list automatically. Hit enter when you've got the one you want, and you don't have to touch the mouse to bring it up. Now, question, is there a list of keyboard shortcuts somewhere? Yes, you'll find that under the help menu. So in the top right corner of Onshape, there's a question mark. If you click that, you'll see keyboard shortcuts in this list, right? All right, so moving on, we are almost out of time, and I want to discuss patterning and mirroring sheet metal parts. This was a limitation in the past. That's no longer the case. You can now pattern and mirror sheet metal parts. So let's walk through a quick example of that. Now, this is no different really than a normal pattern or mirror in the sense that you just select the same exact command from the toolbar. In this case, we'll do a mirror. And I select my part that I want to mirror, in this case, this sheet metal part. I select the plane that I want to mirror it about, in this case, the plane, this face of the part. And it mirrors the part to the other side. Now, if I want these to be one part, in other words, I want to merge this mirror with the previous feature, I just choose add and then choose that part as part of my merge scope. Now, of course, when I mirror this to the other side, I would expect the flat to be one piece, and of course it is, right? So there's my flat view of that part. So I took what was one half of it, mirrored the entire part to the other side, and merged everything to create one. Now, the same goes, by the way, for patterns. So linear patterns or circular patterns, you can get pretty crazy with the shapes that you want to create and still have them unfold. And so I can create something like a circular pattern about this axis and really create, some kind of out there sheet metal parts rather quickly. But again, this was a limitation in the past. You simply couldn't mirror or pattern a part, have it merge, and then have everything unfold as a single sheet metal part. That was a limitation in the past. That's no longer the case. Now, it's important to point out, we do not support yet the face patterns or the feature level patterns. That's something we're working on, but the patterning of the part, like I've shown you here, was added with this most recent update in October. So that's mirroring and patterning sheet metal parts. Let's move on. The last one that I want to mention, of course, besides some of the drawing improvements, is the ability to use guides in the fill command. So in the fill, when you're creating a surface, you now have the ability to reference guides. And in the past, you just simply couldn't do this. And so you're somewhat dependent on, the end types, right? The end conditions with reference to whatever you select. So let me give you an example. Here I'm designing a spray nozzle and I want to close off the end of the spray nozzle. And this is an ideal example where I might use something like a fill. So I choose fill and I select my edges, right? Then make up my fill just like so. Okay. And so there's my fill. Now, in the past, you could specify your continuity with respect to the edges that you selected, but you couldn't click on an actual guide and say, make this my, my definition for the fill. Now you can. You'll see a checkbox for guides and an option to specify guides. In this case, we'll specify curve 4. Right? So I click on curve 4, and now that curve is controlling the shape of my fill, right? So again, you still have the same options as before to define the continuity with respect to the edges that you select, but you also now have the option to define guides. Now, these guides you can have a number of guides, much like the loft command. You can have a number of different guides as you want. You can even have guides that crisscross like this. And another thing I want to stress is the option to define precise or sample. By default, you can see it's set to precise, which means the curve, the surface that gets generated precisely follows your curve. However, if you've done a lot of this, you'll know that if you're going to use a guide like this, you have to have very clear rules to the curve. The curve needs to start and end at the exact points where your fill starts and ends, right? Attached to the entities that you're referencing for your fill. So there's always been these kind of very strict rules for how curves should work if you want to use them for a loft in the past. In the case of fill, we have an option to do what we call sampled. And I think sampled is really useful when you have a combination of guides or a combination of curves, and they may not necessarily end exactly where they need to, right? And you don't want to spend the effort, or you don't want to create multiple curves. You just want to sample the existing curve, even if it doesn't end perfectly, exactly on your edges. That's where sampled can come into play. You can see here I've selected 2 curves for my guides, and I'm sampling those curves, which means it's just grabbing points along the curve and sampling points along that curve and making sure the surface passes through those points. It is not following the curve exactly. In fact, if you set your sample size really low to something like 2, you can see a very real deviation from your curve to the actual generated surface. And if you set this number to higher, like 10, it's going to be a much closer match to the curve. I think sampled is really, really useful in those scenarios where maybe your curve is used for other things, but you also want to use it as a guide for your surface fill, or maybe it doesn't cleanly end exactly where your fill ends and you still want to use it. And that scenario, sampled will work just fine. Whereas precise follows all the same rules as other guides, where it has to start and end exactly where your profiles are, right? That's not the case with sample. So, and again, you can set the sample size. So if you want to really, really closely match the curve, you can, up this number. If you just want to, kind of a rough representation of the curve, you can set this to a lower number. You control what that looks like. But it's much, much more flexible in how it works. So if you ever had a scenario where you go to select a guide and for whatever reason, because it's not terminating correctly, if it's not attached to the profiles correctly, try sample, and it will probably give you the shape that you're working for without hunting down the curve or making a specific curve just for that scenario. All right, so that is the improvements to fill. Again, fill is not a new command. It's really just this option for guides and these options for sampled, precise, and the ability to actually reference guides in your fill. Right. All right. Now, the last thing I have mentioned is just mini drawing improvements. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. But the big thing I would stress in this update, in general, with this update, is you can do things now like duplicate drawings. If you right-click a drawing tab, you can choose the option to duplicate. You can copy and paste notes by alt-dragging the note out. right? So you don't have to copy and paste or recreate notes, Control C, Control V. Just Alt drag a note and it will create a copy of that. The same goes for things like balloons or tolerance symbols or things like that. Really, any annotation in your drawing. If you Alt drag, you'll get a copy. I am officially out of time. There were a few other improvements that are worth mentioning, specifically the ability to hide your bin lines in a flat pattern. If you right-click the flat pattern, you see the option to hide bin lines. That's an important one, I know, for sheet metal. I will stick around and answer any questions that you have. So make sure to stick around if you have any outstanding questions. Let me know. One last thing to mention, if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out learn.onshape.com. It's the Onshape Learning Center. It has self-paced training, instructor-led training, briefings on topics like document organization, folder structure, and so on. So definitely a valuable resource to check out. So that's what I had planned. I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining. I will stick around and answer any questions that you have. But that's it. Thank you, and have a good day.